I'll never forget how it began. It was late, the kind of late where the world outside my window seemed more like a photograph than reality. Everything was still, apart from the faint pulse of red and yellow lights from the distant traffic below. I had been sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I looked up and realized I had been staring out of the window for who knows how long. My building was surrounded by a sea of similar high-rises, each one dotted with darkened windows and the occasional glow of a late-night insomniac. It wasn't unusual for me to get lost in the view. It was something I did to clear my mind when the silence in my apartment felt oppressive. But this time, something was off. Across from me, on the roof of the building directly opposite, a man was standing completely still. I didn't remember noticing him earlier, but there he was, framed against the faint glow of the city skyline. He wasn't looking at me, not exactly, but his head was tilted slightly upward, his figure rigid and unmoving. It wasn't the presence of someone on the roof that was unsettling. People went up there to smoke, to think, to feel the open air. What struck me was the stillness, the way his silhouette seemed carved out of the shadows themselves. My gaze lingered on him longer than I intended. My phone vibrated, breaking the spell. I looked down and saw an unknown number flashing on the screen. For a second I thought about ignoring it, but there was something almost compulsive about the way my thumb slid across the screen to answer. "Hello," I said, my voice low, unsure. There was a pause, a faint crackling of static. Then, a man's voice, deep and oddly flat, spoke. "Stop looking." I froze. My mind scrambled to piece together what I had just heard. I started to respond, to ask who it was, but the line went dead before I could get a word out. My heart was racing as I pulled the phone away from my ear and stared at the blank screen. The logical part of me dismissed it as some kind of prank, but my gaze instinctively darted back to the window. The man was still there, still in the same unnervingly fixed position, but now it felt as if he was aware of me, as though his stillness was deliberate, calculated. I quickly closed the blinds and turned off the light. The rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just paranoia, that I had let some stupid prank call get under my skin. But even after I crawled into bed and closed my eyes, I felt an undeniable pull toward the window, a morbid curiosity to look again. I didn't. Not that night. The next evening, as dusk settled over the city, I went about my routine as usual. I cooked a simple dinner, streamed a show I wasn't really watching, and tried to push the events of the previous night to the back of my mind. But as darkness fell and the familiar stillness of the city took over, I found myself drawn to the window again. It wasn't intentional, it was more like my body moved of its own accord. My fingers gripped the edge of the blinds, and I peeked through them. The man was there. But this time he wasn't on the roof. He was standing on the balcony of the top floor, one story closer to where I was. My stomach dropped. There was no denying it now, no way to explain it away as coincidence. My breathing quickened as I stepped back, letting the blinds fall closed. I paced the room, wringing my hands and glancing at my phone, half expecting another call. None came. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? That a man was standing on a balcony across from me, that he had somehow moved closer to my window overnight. It sounded ridiculous. They'd probably tell me to stop wasting their time. By midnight, my nerves were frayed, and exhaustion began to take over. I checked the locks on my door twice, pulled the curtains tightly shut, and crawled into bed. I told myself I wouldn't look again. Whatever was happening, it would go away if I just ignored it. I convinced myself I was being irrational, letting my imagination get the better of me. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the building, every distant sound from the street below, felt magnified, like it was happening right outside my door. And when I did drift off, I dreamed of dark shapes moving silently through the city, their faces obscured by shadow. The third night I didn't bother pretending I wouldn't look. I knew I would. The compulsion was too strong, an itch that demanded to be scratched. The apartment was dark except for the faint glow of the city lights filtering through the edges of the curtains. My hand hesitated on the cord, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure I could hear it. Slowly, I pulled the blinds open just enough to peek through. The man was now on the balcony of the next to top floor. This time I couldn't suppress the sharp gasp that escaped my lips. He was still unnervingly still, his face obscured by shadow, but I could feel his presence more acutely than ever. My skin crawled with the sensation of being observed, even though his eyes weren't visible. I slammed the blinds shut and backed away, my mind racing. I grabbed my phone and tried to distract myself, scrolling aimlessly through social media, but it was useless. The fear had burrowed too deeply into my brain. It was around 2 a.m. when I decided to call a friend, Sarah, the only person I felt I could confide in without sounding completely insane. She answered groggily, her voice heavy with sleep. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" she mumbled. I know, I'm sorry," I said quickly, trying to keep my voice steady. Something weird is happening, and I don't know what to do." I told her everything: the man on the roof, the phone call, the way he seemed to be moving closer each night. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "That's really creepy," she said finally. "Are you sure it's not just some kind of coincidence? Maybe he lives in that building, and you're just noticing him more now because of the call?" "Maybe," I said, though I didn't believe it. But why would someone call me and tell me to stop looking? And how would they even know I was looking in the first place? "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But it's probably nothing. You're safe in your apartment. Just keep your curtains closed and try to get some sleep, okay? You're probably overthinking this." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, that I was just blowing things out of proportion. But as I hung up the phone and sat alone in the silence of my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, irreparably wrong. The hours dragged on, each one marked by the unnerving quiet that only a city at night can produce. It wasn't silence exactly, but the absence of anything familiar, a low hum that seemed to vibrate in my chest, making my breath shallow and uneven. Sarah's words replayed in my mind, her reassurance falling flat against the rising tide of dread that had taken hold of me. I tried to distract myself, flipping through streaming services, reading articles, even attempting to journal, but everything felt hollow and distant. The window loomed like a black hole in the corner of my vision, an abyss I couldn't help but feel was watching me just as intently as I avoided it. At some point, exhaustion won. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke with a start to the sound of something scraping against my balcony door. My heart lurched into my throat as I bolted upright on the couch. For a moment I thought it might have been part of a dream, but the noise came again, a deliberate, dragging sound that sent chills crawling across my skin. My apartment was still dark, the blinds still closed, but I could see the faint outline of the glass door leading to the balcony. The sound was coming from there. I held my breath, straining to listen. There was a pause, a moment of unbearable silence, and then the faintest tap, 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 like fingernails rapping softly against the glass. I wanted to run, to lock myself in the bathroom or grab a knife from the kitchen, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place as the tapping continued, methodical and unrelenting. My eyes darted to the blinds covering the balcony door. They were slightly parted, just enough for me to see the faint outline of something or someone standing on the other side. My phone was still in my hand, and with trembling fingers I dialed Sarah's number. The ringing seemed deafening in the stillness, each tone stretching an eternity. Finally, she answered, her voice groggy but concerned. "Hello, what's wrong?" "He's here," I whispered, barely able to form the words. "He's on my balcony." "What? Who's on your balcony?" "The man," I said, tears pricking my eyes. "The one from the other building. He's here. I don't know how, but he's here." "Call the police," she said urgently. "Right now. Don't open the door. Don't do anything. Just call the police." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and ended the call. My fingers fumbled as I tried to dial 911, my hands shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the phone. Before I could press the final number, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the door, waiting for anything to happen. Then slowly the blinds began to move. At first it was subtle, just a slight sway as if caught by a breeze. But there was no breeze. My apartment was sealed, every window shut, every vent quiet. The movement grew more pronounced, the blinds rattling softly, as though something was brushing against them from the other side. My phone slipped from my grasp and clattered to the floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. And then I saw it, a hand, pale, elongated fingers curled around the edge of the blinds, pulling them aside with a deliberate slowness that made my stomach churn. I couldn't see his face, not yet, but I knew it was him. The same man, the same figure that had been standing on the roof, then the balconies. He was here now, impossibly close, separated from me by nothing more than a thin pane of glass. I finally found the strength to move, scrambling off the couch and backing away toward the kitchen. My foot struck the coffee table, sending it skidding across the floor with a loud scrape. The noise seemed to break whatever trance had gripped me, and I darted for the knife block on the counter. My fingers closed around the handle of a chef's knife, the weight of it both comforting and terrifying in my trembling hands. When I turned back toward the balcony door, the blinds were still, the hand was gone. The only thing I could see was my own reflection in the glass, pale and wide-eyed, staring back at me. For a fleeting moment, I thought it might all have been in my head, some cruel trick of exhaustion and paranoia. But then the phone rang. The unknown number. The sound of it made me jump, nearly dropping the knife. I didn't want to answer, but some irrational part of me needed to. I needed to hear his voice, to confirm that this wasn't just some elaborate nightmare. With shaking hands, I picked up the phone and pressed it to my ear. "I told you to stop looking," the voice said. There was no anger, no urgency, just a calm, measured tone that made my skin crawl. But you didn't listen. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice breaking. There was a long pause, and for a moment, I thought the line had gone dead. But then he spoke again, his voice quieter this time, almost a whisper. "Turn around." Every muscle in my body tensed as the words sank in. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know. But the compulsion was too strong. Slowly I turned, my eyes scanning the darkened apartment. At first I didn't see anything. The shadows seemed deeper, thicker somehow, but nothing moved. And then I saw him. He was standing in the corner of the living room, just beyond the faint glow of the city lights. His face was still obscured, but his outline was unmistakable. Tall, thin, impossibly still. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as he took a single step forward. The sound of his footfall was impossibly loud, a dull thud that seemed to reverberate through the room. I tightened my grip on the knife, my knuckles white. "Stay away from me," I said, my voice trembling but firm. He didn't respond. Another step. Closer now. I could see more of him, the sharp angles of his face emerging from the shadows, his eyes black and empty, like voids locking onto mine. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. It was like being caught in a nightmare, the kind where you know you're dreaming but can't wake up. Another step. Another. And then he stopped. Barely a few feet away now, his presence filled the room with an unbearable weight, as if the very air around him had thickened. My hand trembled so violently that the knife in my grip felt like it might slip free. The man stood there, his face just barely illuminated by the faint light spilling in from the window. It was wrong, not just unsettling, but fundamentally, horrifyingly wrong. His skin was unnaturally smooth, almost waxy, and his eyes, those empty black voids, seemed to pull at me, drawing me closer, even as every fiber of my being screamed to retreat. I tried to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. All I could do was stare as he tilted his head slightly, the gesture mechanical, like a puppet on strings. And then he smiled. It wasn't a natural smile, not one born of joy or malice. It was too wide, the corners of his mouth stretching further than they should, revealing teeth that were too straight, too even, too perfect. It was a mask of humanity, worn by something that didn't quite understand what it meant to be human. He raised a hand, slow and deliberate, and pointed to the window. My stomach lurched as I followed the gesture, turning my head just enough to see. The blinds were no longer closed. They hung limply to the side, revealing the full expanse of the balcony, and it wasn't empty. There were more of them. Figures like him, standing in perfect, unnatural stillness, their faces turned toward my apartment. There were 6, maybe 7 of them, spaced evenly across the balcony like mannequins in a display. Each one was as unnervingly wrong as the man inside, their features too smooth, their eyes too dark, their bodies too stiff. I wanted to scream, to bolt, to do anything but stand there frozen in place, but I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. And then, as one, they tilted their heads. Not at me, but at him. The man in my living room. It was a subtle movement, almost imperceptible, but the synchronicity of it made my blood run cold. It was as if they were waiting for his command, for some unspoken signal to act. The man lowered his hand, the smile never leaving his face. "You were warned," he said, his voice as calm and hollow as it had been on the phone. "I didn't do anything," I choked out, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't even know who you are." His smile faltered, just for a moment, before returning with even greater intensity. "You saw," he said simply, as though that explained everything. "I don't understand," I pleaded, my eyes darting between him and the figures on the balcony. "What do you want from me?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his movements unnaturally smooth, almost gliding across the floor. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the kitchen counter. The knife felt useless in my hand, a flimsy defense against whatever this was. He stopped just inches away from me, his face so close that I could see the faint, unnatural sheen of his skin, like plastic stretched too tightly over bone. "You didn't stop looking," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And now they see you too." Before I could process what he meant, there was a sound behind me, a sharp, metallic scraping that made my blood turn to ice. I spun around, knife raised, just in time to see the balcony doors sliding open. I hadn't unlocked it. I hadn't even gone near it. But now it stood ajar, the cold night air spilling into the apartment. And they were coming in. The figures moved in unison, their steps eerily synchronized, their faces blank but somehow filled with intent. I stumbled back toward the living room, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The man didn't move to stop them. He simply stood there, watching, his smile unwavering as the figures closed in around me. I swung the knife wildly, a desperate, instinctive act of self-preservation, but it was like trying to fight shadows. The blade passed through empty air as they moved, always just out of reach, their movements fluid and precise. One of them stepped forward, close enough that I could see the unnatural smoothness of its face, and reached out a hand. I tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The wall was at my back, and they were all around me now. The hand brushed my arm, and a shock of cold shot through me, so intense that it left me gasping. It wasn't just the physical sensation, it was deeper, a bone-deep chill that seemed to sap the very warmth from my body. My vision blurred, my knees buckling as the room tilted violently around me. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the man, standing motionless in the center of the room, his smile as bright and unnatural as ever. When I woke, the apartment was empty. The blinds were closed, the balcony door locked, and there was no sign of the figures or the man. At first, I thought it might have all been a dream, some fevered hallucination brought on by exhaustion and paranoia. But as I sat up, I felt a strange weight in my chest, a heaviness that wasn't there before. And then I saw it. On the window, faint but unmistakable, was a single handprint. Too large, too perfect, pressed into the glass from the inside. I don't look out my window anymore, but sometimes late at night I can feel them. Waiting, watching. Closer, always closer. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the handprint on the glass. The rest of the apartment was still too still, as if it were holding its breath along with me. My thoughts spun, frantic and disjointed, grasping at any shred of logic to explain what was happening. But no matter how hard I tried, nothing made sense. The man, the figures, the way they moved. It was all wrong, impossibly wrong. When I finally found the courage to move, it was only to grab my phone. My fingers trembled as I dialed Sarah again. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before she picked up. Her voice was groggy, a mix of concern and irritation. "What now?" she mumbled, clearly still half asleep. "They were in my apartment," I whispered, glancing toward the window as though speaking too loudly might summon them back. "They came in. I don't know how, but they were here." What? Her tone sharpened, the sleepiness evaporating. "Who? The man? Did you call the police? They're not human, Sarah, I said, my voice breaking. I don't know what they are, but they're not normal. There were more of them. They touched me. It was like I stopped, unable to find the words. How could I explain the bone-deep cold, the way it felt like they had reached inside me and taken something? Okay, she said, her voice shaking slightly. Listen to me. I'm coming over. Just sit tight, keep your doors locked, and don't look outside. Do you hear me? Don't look. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Hurry, I whispered. The call ended, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence once more. I clutched the phone tightly, my gaze darting around the room. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me, every creak of the building a harbinger of something worse. I wanted to believe that Sarah could help, that her presence would somehow make this all less real. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever this was, it wasn't something she or anyone could fix. I moved to the couch, curling into myself as I waited. My eyes were fixed on the door, willing Sarah to arrive. Minutes felt like hours, the oppressive silence gnawing at my sanity. And then, faintly at first, but growing louder, I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. My breath hitched. The sound was coming from the window again. Slowly, as though drawn by some invisible force, I turned to look. The blinds were still closed, but the tapping continued, steady and deliberate. My chest tightened as I stared at the fabric, half expecting it to move, to part, to reveal one of them standing there. Then the tapping stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic scraping sound. It was worse than the tapping, more invasive, like nails being dragged across the glass. My hands clenched into fists as I fought the urge to look, to pull the blinds aside and confirm what I already knew. They were there, watching me, waiting. The scraping stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was silence. I held my breath, my ears straining for any hint of movement. And then came the whisper, a voice so faint it was barely audible, but it sent shivers racing down my spine. Come closer. My stomach churned. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was something behind it, something dark and insidious. It wasn't the man's voice. It was someone or something else. My body was paralyzed with fear, but my mind screamed at me to run, to hide, to do anything but stay in that room. The sound of footsteps echoed through the apartment. Not outside, not on the balcony inside. My heart thundered in my chest as I realized the sound was coming from the hallway, from the direction of the front door. My gaze snapped to the door, the knife still clutched in my hand. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, drawing closer with each step. And then, just as they reached the other side of the door, they stopped. Sarah, I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer. My hand tightened around the knife as I took a hesitant step toward the door. Sarah, is that you? I asked again, my voice louder this time. Still nothing. I moved closer, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. Slowly I reached for the peephole, pressing my eye to the glass. The hallway was empty. I backed away from the door, my pulse racing. I didn't know what to do. If it wasn't Sarah, then who or what had been out there? And why had the footsteps stopped? My mind raced through every possibility, each one more terrifying than the last. Then, the door handle moved. It wasn't a knock or a bang, just the quiet, deliberate turn of the handle, as though someone on the other side was testing it. I let out a strangled gasp and stumbled backward, clutching the knife like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. The handle turned again, this time more forcefully, but the deadbolt held. My breaths came in shallow gasps as I stared at the door, waiting for the next move. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stayed frozen in place, every muscle in my body coiled like a spring. Minutes passed, maybe more, before I finally mustered the courage to move. My legs felt like jelly as I crossed the room to the window, pulling the blinds aside just enough to see the street below. Sarah's car was parked in front of the building. Relief flooded through me, though it was short-lived. If Sarah was here, then why hadn't she come up? My fingers hovered over my phone, ready to call her again, but a movement in the corner of my vision stopped me. I turned my head slowly, dreading what I might see. The man was there, standing on the balcony again, just a few feet away from the glass. His smile was gone now, replaced by an expression I couldn't read, something cold and detached, like he was studying me, deciding what to do next. Behind him, the other figures were lined up once more, their faces turned toward me. And then they moved, not toward the door or the window, but upward, their bodies lifting from the ground as if carried by an unseen force. They rose higher and higher, disappearing into the darkness above. The man didn't follow. He stayed where he was, his eyes locked onto mine. And then, in a voice that barely sounded like his own, he said 3 words that will haunt me forever. "They'll be back." The lights in my apartment flickered, and when they came back on, he was gone. The balcony was empty. The handprint on the glass had vanished. And I knew, deep in my soul, that this was far from over. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the center of the room with every light on, clutching the knife and staring at the front door. My thoughts spiraled, each one more paranoid than the last. Every sound, every flicker of the lights, sent my nerves jolting like live wires. I kept replaying his words in my head, "They'll be back." Not, "I'll be back." They. The hours stretched on until the faint light of dawn began to creep through the edges of the blinds. I waited for Sarah to call, to text, to knock on my door, but there was nothing. Her car was still parked outside when I checked the window, but she hadn't come upstairs. A sickening thought crept into my mind. What if she had? What if she'd been the one at the door? What if she'd never made it past the hallway? I couldn't sit there any longer. Grabbing my phone, I dialed her number. It rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Then, finally, her voicemail picked up. My voice cracked as I left a message, pleading for her to call me back, to let me know she was okay. But even as I hung up, I knew she wouldn't. Something had happened to her. Something I couldn't explain. By mid-morning, I forced myself to leave the apartment. I told myself it was to check on Sarah, to find answers, but the truth was I couldn't stay there a second longer. The air inside felt heavy, oppressive, like the walls were closing in on me. I threw on a coat and hurried downstairs, my eyes darting to every shadow as I made my way to the front door. The doorman wasn't there, which was strange. It was a small comfort to see him, usually a sign of normalcy. But today the desk was empty. When I stepped outside, the cold morning air hit me like a slap. Sarah's car was still there, parked slightly askew as though she'd stopped in a hurry. The driver's side door was unlocked. My hand trembled as I pulled it open, my heart sinking as I looked inside. Her purse was on the passenger seat, her phone sitting on top of it. The keys were still in the ignition. "Sarah," I called out, my voice echoing faintly in the empty street. There was no answer. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. She wouldn't have just left her car like this. She wouldn't have gone anywhere without her phone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I turned to look back at my building. It loomed above me, the rows of windows staring down like hollow eyes. I scanned the balconies, the rooftops, half expecting to see him or them watching me. But there was nothing. The building was silent, as if holding its breath. I didn't know what to do. Going to the police felt useless. How could I explain what had happened without sounding insane? That I was being stalked by something not entirely human. That my best friend had vanished without a trace after warning me to stay away from the windows. They'd dismiss me, chalk it up to stress or paranoia, and maybe they'd be right. But then, as I stood there, a noise cut through the stillness. It was faint at first, a low hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It grew louder, more distinct, until I recognized it for what it was: voices. Dozens of them, whispering in unison, their words overlapping in a jumbled, incomprehensible chorus. They were coming from the building. I froze, my breath hitching as I strained to make out the words. It was like trying to decipher a language I didn't understand, the syllables twisting and overlapping in ways that didn't make sense. But one word emerged from the cacophony, clear and unmistakable. "Look." My head snapped upward, my eyes drawn to the top of the building. And there, on the rooftop, they stood. A row of figures, identical to the ones I'd seen on the balcony, their silhouettes stark against the pale morning sky. They didn't move, didn't react, they just stood there, watching me. No, not watching me. Watching something behind me. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. Across the street, on the rooftop of the opposite building, stood another group of figures, and behind them, another, and another. They were everywhere, lining the rooftops and balconies of every building as far as I could see. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all of them motionless, all of them facing me. I staggered back, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow and frantic as I spun around, searching for any sign of an escape. The voices were louder now, their whispers a deafening roar that filled my head, drowning out every coherent thought. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Silence. The figures didn't move, didn't vanish. They remained perfectly still, their presence an overwhelming weight pressing down on me. But the silence was worse. It felt like the calm before a storm, the moment when you know something terrible is about to happen, but can do nothing to stop it. I don't remember how I made it back inside. My memories from that point are a blur, a rush of movement, the slam of a door, the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. When I finally came to, I was in my apartment, the knife still clutched in my hand. The lights were off, the blinds closed, the air thick with a suffocating stillness. They're waiting for me. I can feel it. Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces blank, pale, inhuman. I hear their whispers, echoing in the corners of my mind. I don't know how long I can stay here, how long I can keep them out. But I know this, they're not just watching anymore. They're coming. Hours passed, or maybe days. I lost track of time. The outside world no longer felt real, it was just a vague, distorted memory. My apartment became a cage, the walls closing in as I tried to convince myself I could wait it out, that they'd go away if I stayed hidden long enough. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The whispers didn't stop. Sometimes they were faint, like the murmur of distant conversations bleeding through the walls. Other times they surged, a tide of overlapping voices so loud it felt like my skull would crack under the pressure. The words were fragmented, foreign, but always punctuated by one that I could understand. Look. The word repeated like a command, echoing in my mind long after the whispers subsided. The figures didn't appear in the windows again, but I could feel them. Their presence was a weight, a pressure that pressed against the edges of my awareness, growing heavier with each passing moment. I kept the knife with me at all times, though I knew it was useless. What good was a blade against something like this? Against them? I tried to eat, to drink water, but everything tasted wrong. Stale, metallic. My body was shutting down, consumed by fear and exhaustion. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. I heard their voices. On the third day, or maybe the fourth, I couldn't take it anymore. The whispers had reached a fever pitch, a relentless barrage of noise that filled every corner of the apartment. I screamed at them to stop, to leave me alone, but my voice was swallowed by the din. My chest ached, my vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I might collapse. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The silence was immediate, oppressive. My ears rang in the absence of sound, my breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, I dared to hope it was over, that they'd finally left. But then I heard it. A knock. It was soft, almost polite, but it echoed through the apartment like a gunshot. My body went rigid as I stared at the door, my grip tightening on the knife. The knock came again, 3 short raps evenly spaced, as though whoever or whatever was on the other side was trying to keep from alarming me. "Who's there?" I managed to croak, my voice barely audible. No response. I took a step toward the door, my legs shaking so badly I thought they might give out beneath me. Another knock. This time it was followed by a voice, a familiar voice. "It's me," Sarah said, her tone calm, almost soothing. "Let me in." Relief flooded through me, so sudden and overwhelming that it brought tears to my eyes. Sarah, she was alive. She'd come for me. I rushed to the door, my hand hovering over the deadbolt. But something stopped me. A faint, nagging sense of wrongness. Her voice was too calm, too even. And then I remembered the whispers, the way they'd mimicked familiar sounds, twisted them into something else. "How do I know it's you?" I asked, my voice trembling. There was a pause. Then, she laughed a soft, melodic laugh that sent a chill down my spine. "Don't be silly," she said. "Who else would it be?" I hesitated, my hand trembling as it hovered over the lock. It sounded like her, but not exactly. There was an edge to her voice, a strange flatness that didn't belong. My mind raced, torn between the desperate need to believe it was her and the unshakable certainty that it wasn't. "Go away," I said, stepping back from the door. "You're not her." The knocking stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then came a soft, wet sound, like something heavy dragging across the floor. My stomach churned as the noise grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the door. I backed away, my breath hitching as I stared at the wood, waiting for it to break down, for something to come through. But nothing happened. The noise stopped, and the apartment fell silent once more. My body sagged with relief, but it was short-lived. A new sound emerged, faint at first but growing louder with each passing second. It was coming from the window. Tap, tap, tap. I spun around, my heart pounding as I stared at the blinds. The tapping was slow and deliberate, the same as before, but this time it was accompanied by something else. A shadow moved behind the blinds, faint but unmistakable. It was taller than any human, its shape warped and unnatural, as though it was pressed too tightly against the glass. "Go away," I whispered, clutching the knife so tightly that my knuckles turned white. "Leave me alone." The shadow didn't move. The tapping continued, relentless and steady, and then the blinds began to part. My body froze as they slid open, revealing not one, but two figures standing on the other side of the glass. They weren't like the others. Their faces were human Sarah's face, and the man from before. But their eyes were wrong, dark and empty, and their mouths were stretched into the same two wide smiles I'd seen that first night. "Let us in," Sarah's voice said, though her lips didn't move. The words seemed to come from everywhere at once, filling the room like the whispers had before. "You've been chosen." Chosen for what I managed to croak, my back pressed against the far wall. The man's smile widened, impossibly large, to see. And then the glass shattered. The figures surged into the room, their bodies moving with an unnatural fluidity. I swung the knife wildly, screaming as they closed in around me, but it was no use. The blade passed through them like air, their forms flickering and distorting as they surrounded me. The cold returned, deeper and more intense than before, spreading through my body until I could no longer feel my hands, my feet, my heart. As my vision faded, I saw them, all of them. The figures from the rooftops, the balconies, the shadows. They filled the room, their empty eyes locked onto mine, their smiles wide and endless. And then, everything went dark. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I woke, I was lying on the floor of my apartment. The window was intact, the blinds drawn, the knife still clutched in my hand. It was as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Because now, when I look out the window, I see them everywhere. On the rooftops, in the reflections of windows, in the shadows that stretch just a little too far. They're always there, watching, waiting. And every night, I hear the whispers. "Look, I don't know how much longer I can resist."